Okay, we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to this IES webinar addressing the climate and nature crises holistically. This webinar has been organised by the IES Climate Action Community. And reflecting on the discussions at COP28, it's really important to remember the interlinked nature of the climate and biodiversity crises. Addressing these issues holistically will be dependent on developing solutions with multiple benefits for both nature and climate adaptation and mitigation. This event is going to feature expert presentations exploring how the crises can be addressed together, the role of nature-based solutions in supporting sustainability, and how new reporting frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures can support organisations in identifying the risks and opportunities related to climate and nature in their work. Today, I'm delighted to have presentations from three experts in this area. We're going to hear from all of the speakers first before we'll go into a joint Q&A session. In terms of the questions, you can submit these at any point during the presentations using the Q&A function. You can usually find that at the bottom of your screen. And as we have multiple speakers today, if your question is for a particular speaker, please do specify this in the question. Great. So first off, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Pete Smith. Pete is Professor of Soils and Global Change at the University of Aberdeen and is also the Science Director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise. His interests include climate change mitigation, soils, agriculture, food systems, ecosystem services modelling, and nature-based solutions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Pete. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ethne. I'll share my screen. Thank you. Now you can hopefully see the full screen there.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about why we need to tackle the climate change and biodiversity crises together. I'm going to draw mainly on outputs from IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they're now both working on looking at how nature-based solutions can tackle the climate crises and the biodiversity crises together. And I'll complement that with some other work that I've done in the area. So the reason we need some greenhouse gas removal is because to get to net zero, we need more than just conventional abatement technologies. If you look at this slide, this shows the business as usual in the yellow at the top of the slide, and that's obviously not where we need to be. To hit a 1.5 target or a 2 degrees target as set out in the Paris Agreement, we need to be on this lower trajectory, which is the red line. But as you can see, if you look at the shading underneath the curve, you can see that we can get most of the way with conventional abatement technologies. And this is moving away from fossil fuels and other technologies that produce greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane predominantly, and replacing those by energy sources which don't. So these include most renewables, all renewables in fact, and can include others such as nuclear. But what you'll see in the brown shading beneath the curve is that there are still some emitting technologies in the mix. That's because agriculture emits nitrous oxide and methane, and there's just about everything you can do won't eliminate those emissions completely. So we've got to eat food, which means that we need to produce food through agriculture and other and fisheries and such like. And that means that we're still going to have some emitting technologies in the mix, even when we've done everything we possibly can to reduce emissions. So in order to offset those emissions, to balance those emissions that are still in the mix, shown in brown, we need this section shown in blue, which is carbon dioxide removal technologies. So these are things like creating carbon sinks by planting more trees, managing our peatlands better and in our soils. And I'll come on to that in a moment. It can also include technological and engineering solutions. So this was conceptualized in a way, in this way, between natural and technological solutions in the Bridging the Gap report from 2017. The carbon dioxide removal options or greenhouse gas removal can be technological. So this includes things like direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. This is where you use engineering solutions to scrub CO2 from ambient air, and then you pump that CO2 back underground into saline aquifers or depleted oil and gas reserves. So this is a technological solution, but it tends to be costly and energy intensive. So if we look over on the left-hand side of the slide here, these ones shown in green, these are the natural sinks, the natural greenhouse gas removal that we can use. So there's the one that you all have heard about is afforestation, reforestation. So that's planting trees to soak up carbon and to lock up carbon away from the atmosphere in the biosphere. Another one that you might have heard of is soil carbon sequestration. That's managing our land better, so that we can store more carbon in the soil. And there are other options available, such as biochar or management of other forms of land like peatlands and wetlands. So looking at these technologies, I'm going to focus on the natural technologies today, because these are the ones that can be, if implemented correctly, can be nature-based solutions, which deliver also not only to climate change, but also to biodiversity improvement. So in a landmark paper by Bronson Griscom and colleagues in 2017, this was the first to really put together an inventory of what's possible in terms of mitigation from land-based solutions. So these were so-called natural climate solutions, and includes things like, we can see there on the right of the slide, forests, lots of interventions in forest management. For example, reforestation, improved plantations, avoided fuel wood, for example. There are lots of solutions available in agriculture and grasslands, and a number of them are listed here, both in croplands and grazing lands. And there are also interventions in coastal wetlands and inland peatlands and peats, and inland wetlands and peats, for example, by restoring those areas and protecting the intact peatlands. What we can see, I mean, you don't need to worry too much about the figures, but it shows here that the reforestation, just reforestation alone, could potentially remove greenhouse gas to the tune of between about 3 to 10 gigatons or petagrams of CO2 per year. Just to put that in context, we're emitting about 50 tons of CO2 equivalents every year now. So that is potentially getting up to about a fifth of that, a fifth of those emissions could be potentially mopped up every year if we were quite aggressive with our reforestation targets. Not all of the natural climate solutions are nature-based solutions, and I'll come on to that in a moment. The reason is nature-based solutions also have to contribute to biodiversity, and they also have to involve the inclusion in the decision making of indigenous and local people in that decision making. So it's something that is done from the bottom up with the involvement of communities. So what we did between the IPCC and IPBES is we tried to assess these different technologies in terms of their potentials for mitigation for climate change, adaptation for climate change, and their biodiversity impact. This is the first one that we looked at. These are options that are available in the ocean. So there's ocean carbon storage, coastal and marine ecosystems, fisheries, agriculture and sustainable diets, ocean-based renewable energy. They all quite have a significant mitigation potential. There aren't many estimates for that adaptation potential, but the biodiversity impact, which is positive, is shown here, and all of them have a positive impact, which ranges from low to high. And what's shown over on the right-hand side here is just the summary. So it's all showing they're all good for mitigation. Two of them in particular are good also for biodiversity, with some question marks over their adaptation potential. But this is mostly limited by data. So that's the ocean options. The land-based options, and there are lots more. I don't want you to read through all of these, but most of these have numbers. So we've got a mitigation potential there in gigatons of carbon dioxide that can be removed every year. We've got an adaptation potential, the number of people that will potentially benefit from this intervention, which is ranging from the millions up to the billions of people that could benefit from these interventions. And also the impacts on biodiversity shown in the third column, which can be low, medium or high, or positive or negative. And the summary column over on the right here, shown in the green icons, shows that nearly all of these land-based options are positive for either mitigation or adaptation or both. and most of them have a significant positive impact on biodiversity too. The only one which doesn't on this slide, shown here in this triangle with a lizard inside, with a negative impact, is afforestation. So this is planting trees on land that wouldn't otherwise have trees, and this usually takes the form of plantation forestry with monocultures of non-indigenous woodlands, and this could potentially have a negative impact on biodiversity compared to the ecosystem that was there before. But most of them, the takeaway message is that most of these things could be implemented in a way that constitutes a nature-based solution and be positive for both climate change and biodiversity. The last few on the slide are just showing another negative impact, potentially a very large scale bioenergy or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, if occupying very large land areas, and again planting non-native species in large monoculture plantations. This could be bad for biodiversity, although it would have a positive impact on climate. And lastly, there are a few interventions on the demand side. So these are what we can do in our demand. So, for example, dietary change, reduced post-harvest waste, and reduced consumer and retailer waste, and management of supply chains and enhanced urban systems. These contribute positively where we've got estimates to climate change and to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and they all have high, medium, or high positive impacts on biodiversity. So this was just an assessment of what's out there, what actions have been proposed for climate change and their impacts on biodiversity. And by and large, most of them, if they're implemented sensibly, contribute positively to climate change and to biodiversity. Looking at this the other way round, my colleague Shin et al. Published a paper around about the same time we published our summary. This was looking at the post-2020 action targets for biodiversity for 2030 and looked at the impact on climate change mitigation. 14 out of the 19 action targets for 2030 have positive impacts on climate change. So it doesn't matter if you're implementing a change for climate change or if you're implementing it to improve biodiversity. If you get it right, you can co-deliver to both. So overall, it's a very positive story. If we just zoom into the UK, this is some work we did for the RSPB and WWF, working out what contribution nature-based solutions could have for climate change mitigation and also for contributing positively to biodiversity. And nature-based solutions either protect intact ecosystems, for example, peatlands, woodlands, and permanent grasslands have high carbon stocks. Where they've been degraded, where peatlands or forests or coastal systems have been degraded, we can restore those, and that creates a carbon sink, which would soak up carbon from the atmosphere. We can manage our woodlands and our soils better by improving agricultural and forestry management. And we can also create new ecosystems, either new woodlands with native trees or creating new habitats in urban environments, for example, for improving heating and cooling and the quality of our local environments. Now, most of the options that involve protecting existing peatlands, woodlands and permanent grasslands are very positive for biodiversity. So 85% of existing carbon-rich habitats deliver biodiversity benefits. There are 15% which have mixed or context-specific nature benefits. For example, overgrazed grasslands contain a lot of carbon, but they're not necessarily the best thing for biodiversity. So this highlights the importance of nature enhancement activities to make sure that when we're protecting these species, we can also improve the biodiversity. And for the other three different categories of options, manage, restore, and create, about half of these actions, 46%, are also good for biodiversity. Remaining 54 could enhance biodiversity if implemented correctly. The takeaway message from this is not so much what you do, but it's the way that you do it. In the words of the old Bananarama song, implementing things in a way that is conducive to biodiversity, that has the involvement of local people, can provide benefits for climate change and biodiversity. So it's just a matter of making sure that we think these things through and get them right. So in conclusion, we have to remember that the land or ecosystems can't do it all. There's not enough land to soak up emissions from other sectors like transport, energy generation and aviation. So we need immediate and aggressive action in all sectors of the economy if we are to meet a net zero target. And that is perhaps the most troubling thing, that I don't think we've seen enough action to tackle fossil fuel use and to tackle greenhouse gas reduction in all sectors of the economy. Only then does it make sense to only when we've done all of that can we rely on nature-based solutions for any form of climate change mitigation. So most land-based greenhouse gas removal options can deliver benefits to ecosystem services and to the UN Sustainable Development Goals if implemented appropriately. Again, coming back to that point about it's how you do it rather than what you do. Because if they're implemented poorly, many land-based and even ocean-based greenhouse gas removal options could harm biodiversity, ecosystem services, and impede the delivery of the UN SDGs Sustainable Development Goals. So appropriate implementation is crucial. If implemented carefully, this is the real takeaway message. Nature-based solutions are good for biodiversity, they're good for people, and they're good for both climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So we have to work very, very hard to make sure the interventions we make in the lands and the ocean are both good for biodiversity and good for climate change. Thank you for your attention. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Pete. That was a really interesting overview of how we can address the two crises together, and some illustrations of nature-based solutions and their benefits. So thank you so much for that. And to all our attendees, please do put your questions for Pete in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentations. So next up, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Matthew Ling, Nature-Based Solutions Lead at GHD. Matthew is an environmental professional with over 15 years' experience across consultancy, local government, and NGO sectors, focusing on environment, ecology, biodiversity, restoration, and climate. Matthew has authored a number of reports on the topics of natural capital, ecosystem services, ecosystem assessment, biodiversity, and green infrastructure. Thank you so much for joining us, Matthew. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Many thanks for that introduction, Ethne, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. Hopefully, what I can present now will build on what Pete's just shared with us and potentially go into a little bit more depth around sort of some of the specifics of nature-based solutions and the role that they have to play in addressing the climate and biodiversity crises, and how such approaches can support corporate level sustainability. So the context and situation we face needs no introduction, and Pete's obviously given us a good roundup of that anyway. Global carbon dioxide emissions continue to increase and are expected to peak in the middle of this decade, and biodiversity faces multiple risks from climate change, land use change, pollution, invasive species, and overexploitation, fueling an accelerated pace of species extinction. The two crises are inextricably linked. One cannot be solved without addressing the other. And it seems that this has only really begun to take, sort of become almost rote very, very recently. It seemed that they were always dealt with in a very siloed fashion until the last couple of years, where the penny seems to have dropped somewhat. Viewing them in isolation makes very little sense, practically nor strategically. Reflecting on the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties, which has just happened in Dubai, there's an important message coming out, and it's really bringing these sentiments together in a way that's never been put into sort of black and white terms as strongly before. So this was summarized in the joint statement on climate, nature and people, which was issued by the UNFCCC COP28 presidency, CBD COP15 presidency, and a collection of chairs of partnerships, initiatives and coalitions and endorsing member countries for COP28, whereby it was stated, there is no path to fully achieve the near and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement or the 2030 goals and targets of the coming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework without urgently addressing climate change, biodiversity loss and land degradation together in a coherent, synergistic and holistic manner. So that really does paint a nice picture for us. For climate change, we know that the biggest part of the equation in putting us on a net zero pathway is rapid and deep decarbonisation, a pathway in some form which has just been laid out at COP28, and a movement towards renewable and other clean or green energy sources. However, even if all emissions halted tomorrow, our atmosphere would continue to warm. This committed warming would likely see global average temperatures increase by 0.6 degrees C, and they would remain destined to be above pre-industrial levels for thousands of years and continue to negatively affect biodiversity. Tackling the biodiversity crises, however, is a more complex challenge. Manifold threats from a growing population, consumerism and consumption, globalization, extreme weather events, and general unsustainable behavior are not easy to unpick and address. Much specific focus and effort is being put into developing technological solutions to help us engineer ourselves out of the climate crisis. However, whilst direct air capture and other carbon capture approaches do offer huge potential, their efficacy remains low. The International Energy Agency classified direct air capture as only being at the large prototype stage, and the largest platform currently online only provides capacity to capture 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year, if operating to its full potential. Of the most well-established direct air capture operators, there is currently only approximately 20 plants of varying sizes up and running, capturing approximately 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. But only half of this is being locked away permanently, with the remainder being distributed for end uses such as in the beverage industry. In their net zero emissions for 2050 scenario, the International Energy Agency suggests that direct air capture approaches will need to capture more than 85 megatons of carbon per year from 2030, rising to approximately 980 megatons per year by 2050. To achieve this level of carbon capture will require rapid and widespread expansion and deployment of direct air capture technology from the present annual capacity of less than 0.01 megatons of carbon dioxide. There are also a range of novel techno-natural systems approaches which offer great potential for carbon sequestration and harvesting, such as microalgae farming. It is estimated that between 1.6 and 2 grams of carbon dioxide is captured for every gram of algal biomass produced using such approaches. Modeling has found that theoretically, microalgae systems using both open and closed culture modes could convert 513 tons of carbon dioxide into 280 tons of dry biomass per hectare per year. If this were rolled out at a significant scale, theoretically, it's estimated that a maximum of 2.35 gigatons of carbon dioxide could be sequestered across 100,000 kilometers squared of microalgae cultures, which would account for up to 8% of global CO2 emissions reductions. It's clear that these new and emergent technologies and approaches to help in the fight against climate change have a lot of potential. And as per the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' statement earlier this year, we need to fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector. In short, everything, everywhere, all at once. And this will require us all to take every means possible. But we must ask ourselves, what other benefits do approaches like direct air capture and microalgae systems provide us with, especially when we consider tackling the twin crises in a combined fashion? Whilst algal systems do rely on nature, they provide little to no direct biodiversity benefit. And the algal biomass could provide feedstock for bioenergy and biofuel production through biorefinery. And it could also be used as a source for producing pharmaceutical and cosmetic products, nutritional supplements, fertilizers, and animal feeds. So there are a range of additional benefits from taking this type of approach, but not for biodiversity. Whereas there are no co-benefits arising from direct air capture over and above supporting employment. It's also important to mention that it's a hugely energy-intensive process, and there's a question mark over whether or not the deployment of enough direct air capture resources globally to hit meaningful targets could lead to further land use change, displacement, and loss of biodiversity. This must surely be considered in depth. What options does this leave us with then? Thankfully, we don't have to look too far for a solution. The answer is all around us: nature. Nature, by its nature, is resilient, adaptable, and sustainable. It supports us entirely, providing us with essential services and many possibilities, and it regulates our climate. Strategically using nature and its processes to help address societal challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss is known as nature-based solutions. The UN Environment Programme, amending and updating IUCN's previous iteration, defined nature-based solutions as, I need to take a deep breath for this one, actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal and marine ecosystems, which address social, economic and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience and biodiversity benefits, as Pete also described. Nature-based solutions, for me, really are the perfect vehicle to help us tackle the combined climate and biodiversity crises holistically. Looking to natural solutions, regardless of whether tackling climate change is the main driver or not, will bring about some climate benefits by sequestering atmospheric carbon, storing it, or otherwise preventing its liberation, whilst also providing climate adaptation measures. And NBS approaches should inherently deliver positive outcomes for biodiversity. One of the central tenets of NBS is that they must result in a net gain to biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, as clearly depicted in this conceptual diagram from the IUCN. NBS is an umbrella term. It encompasses many other actions and approaches that seek to employ elements and functions of nature for social, environmental, and economic purposes. This graphic from the European Commission helpfully depicts this, showing that it covers approaches like green infrastructure, sustainable drainage solutions, and urban forestry. It most strongly builds on the ecosystem approach and ecosystem-based adaptation, but it also encapsulates ecological restoration, forest landscape restoration, ecosystem-based mitigation, climate adaptation services, ecosystem protection approaches like area-based conservation and protected area management, and ecosystem-based management, including integrated coastal zone management and integrated water resources management. So NBS really does package together quite a lot of different approaches and actions, some of which you're likely to be already familiar with. This is a conceptual model of nature-based solutions as developed by the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative based out of the University of Oxford. It shows the different categories of NBS action, which are protection, restoration, management, and creation. It demonstrates that not only nature-based solutions, but human well-being and sustainable development as a whole are underpinned and supported by biodiversity. It shows the interaction of people and nature together in the yellow circle, and the ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people, we receive from these interactions in the blue band, from which we benefit. And it demonstrates that the ultimate goal of NBS is to support sustainable development, human health and well-being, and biodiversity. IUCN defines 7 societal challenges which NBS seek to address. These are climate change mitigation and adaptation, disaster risk reduction, economic and social development, human health, food security, water security, and environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. The real beauty of NBS as an approach is that it is a multifunctional approach, delivering multiple environmental, social, and economic benefits all at once. So let us imagine for a moment that we need to deliver a new or replacement drainage system for a new development. You could, of course, put in an engineered system of concrete and plastic pipes, drains, and culverts, which would do the job very well, but they would do nothing above and beyond that. They would just transmit the water from point A to point B. Or, alternatively, you could look to nature and implement a nature-based solutions approach using bioswales, rain gardens, filter strips, retention ponds, urban wetlands, etc. But even with NBS approaches, there are different levels that can be achieved. I love this picture as it provides a powerful visualization of exactly this. The image on the left, technically speaking, is an NBS approach. It's a bioswale, which does provide some habitat value and will tackle the primary challenge of water management. However, with a little bit more ambition, look what was actually achieved in the picture on the right. While still effectively doing the same primary job, it now also provides a much greater range of habitat opportunity to support biodiversity. And I think it's safe to say it provides much more opportunity for engagement and is a real point of interest, supporting human well-being. This can even be taken a step further with the incorporation of woody shrubs and trees into the bioswale, which will provide a range of other ecosystem services like shade, urban cooling, air filtration, and importantly, carbon sequestration and storage. The primary function of these bioswales is to protect against flooding, addressing the disaster risk reduction challenge. But as discussed, they also create important new habitat for pollinators and other invertebrates, as well as habitat for birds, bats, and small mammals, contributing to tackling biodiversity loss. And in the case of the example that included the trees, these systems also sequester and store atmospheric carbon and contribute to the climate change mitigation and adaptation challenge. And finally, these new habitats contribute to urban greening, shade provision, urban cooling, placemaking in general, helping to support human physical and mental well-being, therefore contributing to the human health challenge. So we get all of these returns from taking one approach. The multiple benefits that can be realized from taking NBS approaches is really what differentiates them from traditional single-function engineered options. And that is their unique selling point and why they can be such powerful approaches and should be considered in any sustainability strategy, as they will contribute to the attainment of a range of targets. By looking to nature and implementing nature-based approaches across your operations and your organizations and your project portfolios, it can form an important component in embedding sustainability across business activities. This could be by contributing to net zero targets, alignment with emerging concepts or frameworks like Nature Positive or the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, or to develop resilience and provide protection for assets and infrastructure to the impacts of climate change. It's also well understood that by taking nature-based approaches, organizations demonstrate leadership, enhance their brand, gain competitive advantage, and realize other benefits too. The potential for NBS to contribute to tackling societal challenges has drawn much attention. It's widely regarded by conservation organizations and others that NBS have the potential to help us address many of our biggest challenges. Recognizing the importance of nature-based solutions in helping us meet these challenges, they've been specifically highlighted in numerous global processes. For example, at the Conference of the Parties to the Conventions on Biological Diversity and Climate Change, and the Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change and Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. As I mentioned earlier, while some NBS will be explicitly focused on tackling climate change through carbon sequestration at scale, which can be referred to as natural climate solutions, as per Pete's slide, including afforestation or restoration of seagrass meadows or peatlands, others will have a different focus entirely, like bioreceptive concretes that support the development and establishment of mosses, but they all contribute to tackling climate change on some level. It's estimated that more than 1/3 of climate mitigation measures required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement can be achieved through taking nature-based solutions approaches. Each NBS approach, that is protection, restoration, management, and creation, has a significant role in this equation. Researchers found that by protecting 30% of lands identified as being globally important for biodiversity, this could lead to the prevention of land use change, which could liberate 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. It's also been estimated that the restoration of lands converted for agriculture that exist in priority areas for biodiversity and carbon could lock away 22 gigatons of carbon dioxide in biomass by 2050. And regenerative agriculture could remove between 100 and 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere by the end of the century. The potential is clear. and opportunities exist almost everywhere. Just a few examples are presented here, including green walls and green roofs, wetlands for water attenuation and wastewater treatment, coastal management and protection, urban forestry, sustainable soil management, mangrove restoration and establishment, and woodland creation. In short, there is likely to be an option to incorporate more nature into almost any context and project, with huge potential to contribute to biodiversity net gain, circular economy, net zero, and other sustainability targets. In summary, as shown across the next few slides, there are many opportunities to incorporate nature-based solutions all around us, and by doing so, help to support biodiversity and combat climate change through mitigation and adaptation measures. So, if, for example, you have infrastructural assets that you want to protect, such as energy networks or transport corridors, if you need to manage water transmission, if you are responsible for risk management and planning, if you want to create a better urban environment, if you want to make a more inspiring workplace, or if you have substantive land holdings and are able to restore, rewild, or reforest your land, or to contribute to biodiversity net gain plans for your development, or if you're a water company and want to naturally manage water quality, or even if you're a property developer or agent looking to generate higher market rates. Taking nature-based solutions approaches and embedding more nature into your projects and operations can contribute to each of these targets. And this is my last slide, and I just wanted to set a reminder that NBS, whilst they do have a lot of potential for various different aspects, they are not a silver bullet to all of our problems, and they still need to be conceived and implemented appropriately with the requisite level of stakeholder engagement and buy-in and ecologically led design. And finally, there are plenty of reminders around us that these systems and approaches can and do fail. They are living systems and largely will require some level of maintenance and management to keep them operating effectively and delivering a range of services and benefits required of them. And this is best defined and specified before they are contracted and delivered. Because if these NBS approaches ultimately fail, they will deliver little biodiversity benefit, if any, and may begin emitting carbon dioxide and methane and actually contribute to the climate crisis rather than being part of the solution. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much indeed for your interest and attention, and I will pass you back to Ethne.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was really interesting to delve into some examples of nature-based solutions and to talk about a bit of those multifunctional benefits that nature-based solutions can provide. So thank you so much for that. Again, to all our attendees, please do put your questions for Matthew in the Q&A box. I'm now finally going to introduce our final presenter, Bridget Reid. So sadly, she couldn't join us in person today as she's on a plane right now, I believe. But she has provided a recording of her presentation, which I'm going to play now. And this is focused on TCFD and TNFD, so thinking about that finance side. Bridget is CEO and co-founder of Frontiera and is an ESG and sustainable finance expert working across finance, renewables, and environmental consultancy. With a background in environmental science and environmental impact assessments, she has an in-depth understanding of the complexities and interconnectivity of the risks, opportunities, and impacts of organisations on our environment. She is also a steering group member for the IES Climate Action community. Bear with me now and I'll just get the screen going.
So firstly, thank you so much for joining us here
Great,
today.
thank you.
Apologies, I'm not able to be on the call. I'm currently flying on a plane somewhere between Mexico and Australia. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to dial in today. But to introduce myself, I'm Bridget Reid, CEO and co-founder of Frontiera. I am a sustainable finance and ESG expert and an environmental scientist by training. I started my career working for environmental engineering consultancies, working on environmental and social impact assessments for large scale infrastructure. Before moving across to finance, where I was responsible for ensuring that the investments that were made by the bank that I worked for aligned with their sustainable investment policy. I then moved across to Mexico, which is where I co-founded Frontiera. So who is Frontiera? We are an environmental and geospatial consultancy that utilises geospatial data and satellite technology to analyse and evaluate nature-related risks with a very specific focus on biodiversity and deforestation. We came about because we recognise that there's a critical need for space tech within the kind of financial sector and corporates, but limited capacity to embed this into processes and day-to-day activities. So what exactly we do? Well, we work to bridge what is currently a very large gap, a very large information gap between organisations and the impact that they're having on nature and climate. And we do this a variety of different ways, such as assessing and managing nature-related issues, evidencing compliance with nature-related legislation, such as deforestation-free regulations, helping them align with standards such as TNFD, meeting carbon offsetting commitments, and assisting with sustainability reporting. So today I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on the evolution of international sustainability frameworks, and then we'll take a closer look at some of the key things that a key climate-related disclosure framework, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has just been incorporated into the International Sustainability Standards Board. And then we'll dig into one of the key nature-related disclosure frameworks, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And as TNFD is kind of the new kid on the block, as it was only finalised September this year, we'll look into that in quite close detail. So this section of today's presentation highlights how nature and climate is considered by financial institutions and corporates. So I haven't been lucky enough to hear that the other presenters talks today, but they've been talking about kind of nature-based solutions and how we can address kind of the nature and climate crisis. And this is kind of framing it from the organisational perspective. And so for a lot of organisations, and particularly the boards of many organisations, they see nature and biodiversity and climate through the lens of legislation and sustainability frameworks. So if we look back in time, whilst there has been environmental legislation in place in some countries for decades, international sustainability standards and frameworks really started to only establish themselves at the end of the 90s and in 2000. So we can see here that there was a flurry of activity in 2000 with the release of the Equator Principles, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, CDP, and then things slowly kind of tick over for the next kind of decade and until around 2014, where things started to really pick up the pace. And this timeline is by no means comprehensive, but reflects the key trend that over the past decade, we have seen a tidal wave of sustainability frameworks developed and released. Some of them have been industry specific, some focus on specific areas of sustainability challenge, and from an organisational perspective, this has created a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges in terms of there are now so many sustainability frameworks out there. As a company, which one do I choose? Is it going to can I do multiple? Are they going to conflict? So which is where we are into this kind of next phase, I would say, of international sustainability frameworks. We're now at a point where these frameworks have recognised that this challenge, and so now we're seeing a gradual converging of all of these frameworks. So again, this is by no means comprehensive, but this just gives you a few key examples there that we can see a number of different frameworks such as CDP, SASB, GRI, and TCFD are now sort of all coming together into ISSB, which we'll discuss in further detail in just one second. But just jumping onto TCFD, of the numerous kind of, as we're kind of touching on the climate issue in this talk, of the numerous and ever expanding frameworks, one of the key reporting frameworks for climate change was the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. It's a voluntary framework for organisations to disclose the financial implication of climate change on their business, and it was sort of designed to encourage businesses to actually integrate climate change into the business, so into their risk management, into their processes, into their strategies, and then finally there's a metrics and targets aspect of it too. So there's a number of different metrics and targets that they recommend disclosing against. As of the last and final annual status report that was released in October 2023, it stated that 58% of companies now disclose in line with almost half of TCFD's recommended disclosures. So it's a significant amount that, 58% of companies are now really considering this and really implementing it, but there's still significantly more work to do to increase the uptake. The other thing that's of a particular note about TCFD is many countries are now implementing legislation that requires companies to disclose with TNFD aligned reporting. This goes from countries such as New Zealand to Thailand to Switzerland to Canada. So a variety, a number of countries have now taken this TCFD structure and they're embedding it into legislation now. And so the key kind of evolution in TCFD and this space is that, and as I mentioned, it was the final annual report, TCFD has now been integrated into the International Sustainability Standards Board. So the ISSB was launched by the same organisation that oversees the International Accounting Standards Board. So they're the ones that are responsible for setting global accounting standards used by companies globally to prepare and present their financial statements. So this ISSB is designed to complement that existing accounting standards so that we now have a globally accepted way of reporting sustainability and climate-related issues for companies. So this essentially is a really strong indication that sustainability and climate reporting should now be considered by companies just as important as accounting and financial reporting. And the other key thing to note is that whilst ISSB covers climate and sustainability, it's fairly light touch on nature and biodiversity, which is where the TNFD comes in. So TNFD is a voluntary disclosure. The Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, just to make that clear. Should have spelled that out on the slide here, apologies for that. So it's a voluntary disclosure framework for organisations to report and act on nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks and opportunities with the aim to shift capital towards nature positive outcomes. So the first thing to note, TNFD is anticipated to become to follow the same trajectory as TCFD. So voluntarily initially, then legislated in some jurisdictions, whilst then gradually forming the basis of international and industry-wide reporting standards. We're not sure at this stage if it'll be incorporated into ISSB in the same way that TCFD has. But they are in discussions with it. It's only just been finalised, so potentially sometime in the future. There's been no commitment, but there's potential that it might be incorporated into ISSB as well. Now, TNFD was developed through extensive engagement. They've developed various draft versions of the framework over a course of a year and a half, and they had over, I think, 1,200 forum members, 19 core knowledge partners, 15 consultation groups, and then that 240 pilot projects where they actually tested the framework with organisations before they released it. And from TNFD, from Frontier's perspective, TNFD is one of our key focuses. So we worked on a number of those official pilot projects, and then we're also working with a number of companies at the moment to implement the framework. So returning to the idea of avoiding competing frameworks, TNFD worked really hard to incorporate many other different reporting standards into their framework. And one of the key ones that they worked with was TCFD, which you can obviously, TCFD, TNFD, pick up on in the name. So basically they took the TCFD structure of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, and they really built onto that. They took the recommendations from TCFD and they used that as a basis to adapt and build upon and make it appropriate for nature. And you can see here that some of them, and this is, I guess, where the difference between the climate and nature reporting really comes in, and how businesses and organisations approach climate and nature. You can see that some of the recommendations cover almost directly over. So those in the green boxes, and then some of them are fairly similar, just slight adaptations required, which you can see in the green, in the yellow boxes there. And then finally, there are some completely additional recommendations that are included in TNFD that really recognise the difference between climate and nature and how we manage that. So I'll draw out one particular one, for example, which is this D down here, which refers to describing the location of a business's operations or impact. So location, when it comes to nature and biodiversity, location is very specific. And that's probably one of the biggest differences between addressing climate change from companies addressing climate change and companies addressing nature and biodiversity. And that is the emphasis on knowing where their operations or supply chains are. So it's particularly important when it comes to nature because, and not much such an issue when it comes to climate and GHG emissions. So, for example, you can sequester some carbon in Australia, and that's great news for everyone in the UK right now. Nature, on the other hand, is very different. Location is extremely important as the impacts and risks are really determined by what's happening in the surrounding area. So it's a really very basic example. Think about two agricultural farms that, are exactly the same in every aspect, except one is located in a water-stressed area and one is located in an area where there's plenty of water. Obviously, the one operating in the water-stressed area, when it's drawing down a lot of that water, is creating more risks and more impacts to that surrounding to the surrounding area and ecosystem, which is where kind of the key difference between, I think, nature and climate comes in, and that's that locate aspect. So within TNFD, they've embedded this LEAP approach, locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, to assist companies and organisations to kind of do the back end process. So I like to think of it as the back end of the framework or the counting method that you use to generate your results to report in line with TNFD. So I'm not going to go into, we're limited with time, so I'm not going to go into each of the steps, but just know that behind each of the locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, there's a number of different mechanisms that are recommended by TNFD. Also within the TNFD is core indicators. So I think they've got 14 core metrics, including 9 related to dependencies and impacts, and 5 related risks and opportunities. And then they've got some that are sector-specific metrics, and also they've got a number of additional metrics for flexibility. You can see kind of the indicators, a number of indicators, and each of the indicators, below each of the indicators is a metric attached to it. And you can directly see here the crossover between climate change and nature. As you can see, the top one is climate change being one of the drivers of change impacts to nature. There is still a lot of discussion around how exactly all organisations are going to report against each of these metrics, and I guess that is another thing to note in regards to the difference between, I guess, where we're at with climate and where we're at with nature. We now have a fairly solid processes in place to start reporting on climate. Nature is still we're at the beginning here, where companies are still trying to figure out where their location, where they're actually operating, where their supply chains are, so that they can then start figuring out how to report against those. The other thing to note is TNFD has a whole lot of additional guidance that they've put out. So they've got the recommendations, but then there's sector-specific guidance, biome guidance, target setting. So if you are interested to learn more, there is there's a whole library of documentation there. One thing to note, which might be of use to a number of you, is that at the moment there's draft sector guidance, which is open for comment, and that's covering many different topics, many different sectors, sorry. So, for example, oil and gas, metals and mining, forestry and paper, chemicals, agriculture, and a number of others. So if you are working in any of those spaces, I would really encourage you to jump on the TNFD website and start looking through to see if there's any comments that you would like to give to them. So just to wrap up, I guess what this means in TNFD means in practice, and I guess where we are within the climate and nature, tackling both at the one time. The key kind of things that we've noted with clients is that one of the biggest challenges is identifying where the location of their operations and supply chains are. And this is extremely important, as we've discussed, but more important for It's still important for climate change, but I would say more important for nature. And this is one of the key challenges. So I'd really encourage everyone to start kind of encouraging their organisations to start macroing operations and supply chains. You know, start embedding location data sharing provisions into contracts is the kind of the one of the key things that we would encourage organisations to do. The other key thing, the key takeaway that we found with implementing TNFD is that we found that many organisations really have quickly picked up the clear alignment with decarbonisation strategies. So when they're doing when they're looking at the nature-related risks and opportunities, they've seen how I guess easy it would be to just incorporate into that existing decarbonisation strategy. And the final thing to note is that I think with a lot of organisations we talk to, they're kind of overwhelmed by you know, the thought of addressing nature because it seems so big to deal with. But many of the organisations that we've already started implementing, that we're working with, who have already started implementing actions to address climate change, they recognise that there's often already existing mechanisms and structures in place within their organisations that can be effectively utilised and leveraged to manage nature-related issues. So, for example, many companies already have sustainability committees or sustainability reporting policies and reporting structures. So many organisations initially find it overwhelming to think about nature, but once they start actually drilling down into it and identifying actions, they realise that they've got a pretty good basis that they can build upon. And so that wraps up my time today. If there are, I'm sorry I can't make the questions, but I'm really happy to take questions via email. So my email's up there, or you can always send them to Ethne as well, who can pass them on to me. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the event.
Great. A massive thank you to Bridget for providing that recording for us on TCFD and TNFD. And as she mentioned, more than happy to pass on questions to her that relate to her presentation. So please do just let me know if that's the case. In the meantime, I'm going to jump straight into our Q&A session with Pete and Matthew, who we've got here today. So again, please do put your questions in the box. And a massive thank you to all of our speakers for their presentations. It's been a really, really interesting session. So just to kick us off, I wondered if I could start with a question for you, Pete, which is around oceans and ocean-based and ocean nature-based solutions. So as I'm sure you're aware, oceans had more of a presence at COP28 this year than has been the case for some of the previous COPs. Given that when you talked about the nature-based solutions, there's not that much data available, not that much knowledge on them. Do you think this needs to be a key focus? And what do you think some of the barriers are to understanding oceans in this way?
Yeah, I think there's certainly more. We require more data. We require more research. Partly it's because you can't easily see what happens on the land. You can go around and you can see if a peatland's been restored, or you can see if trees have been planted, or if the soil's been ploughed. It's more difficult to see what's going on. So I guess part of it is to do with it's just more difficult to get to. Have you restored the seagrass properly? Well, you need divers to go out, or you need remote vehicles to verify that visually, and to take measurements about the carbon sequestration rates. So it's definitely a gap. I think there's more information at the zone between the land and the ocean. That's getting better. I would have given you the same answer for the salt marshes and other coastal ecosystems about 5 to 10 years ago, but we're starting to fill that gap, and that gap's going to fill quite rapidly with good quality data. But we do still lack data on most coastal systems, particularly those below the depth of the water, below the surface of the water. The one that we do have some good data on is mangroves, because they're obviously a charismatic ecosystem that's widely recognised across the world, with quite a lot of research groups working on them. So we have quite good data on those. Less so on the kelp beds and the seagrasses and other forms of nature-based solutions in the oceans.
Great, thank you, Pete. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, as you'll know, the blue carbon ecosystems of salt marsh, seagrass and mangroves are quite, they kind of encapsulate blue carbon, but I think they're looking to extend that out a bit further to think about things like oyster beds and kelp. So yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. And Matthew, a question from an attendee, and also to kind of broaden it out a little bit. I wonder, in your experience, what the reception of clients has been, or people you've worked with has been, to implementing nature-based solutions. And the exact example being brought out by an attendee is about heritage agencies and whether they've been buying into nature-based solutions.
Great question. Thank you very much. I think for us at GHD, it's quite a new offering as for the company. So we're still kind of having those, I guess, kind of fledgling conversations and discussions. So I think from our point of view, it's as much about having discussions with our existing client base and new clients to discover where those opportunities lay. And, you know, as per my kind of waxing lyrical style presentation, I can see opportunity almost anywhere. And, you know, I totally buy into what Pete says around the kind of academic side of the true definition of nature-based solutions involving indigenous peoples, etc. But I think you can take that and apply it and work with communities on the ground wherever you are. And that could be through mechanisms like consultations through local authorities, etc. So you can see how it can be applied in almost any given context. And that's the message that I'm pushing to our client base is, you know, with things like biodiversity net gain coming in as being mandatory in January, you've got this palette of options in front of you to select from. What is your challenge? We can find a solution. And that solution obviously can be natural, entirely natural. It could be a hybrid option, so bringing in some engineering into that as well. For me, you know, it's a no-brainer. If you actually start, and that's, I guess, where the TNFD and other reporting mechanisms come into it, is this natural capital accounting, ecosystem services accounting and mapping paints the holistic picture of the complete bundle of benefits we can receive. So when you start looking at the true bottom line, what are the benefits that we can see? So they're kind of the mechanisms we're looking at, and kind of the discussions we're having to, I guess, try and get a bit more traction and get that conversation going a bit more. In terms of heritage agencies, I assume that means things like the National Trust and others. Yeah, I mean, there is plenty of work going on through, you know, even Forest Research, Forestry Commission. But a really nice example to me, I live up in Cambridgeshire, and there's a project not too far away being led by the National Trust and other stakeholders, restoring what's called the Great Fen. So it's re-wetting this historic fenland landscape and the huge peat reserves, and creating this kind of rewilded landscape, and working with what is predominantly a working landscape to investigate where the winds are, how they can work together, so that you're not just displacing a working community and losing those jobs and that important food production land, but where are the opportunities to do that synergistically with a nature conservation angle as well. So yeah, there's definitely interest and definitely buy-in, and lots of processes out there happening, much more than I'm sure I'm already aware of.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And I think you raise a really interesting point there around value and how we value different ecosystems. So beyond kind of thinking purely in terms of biodiversity credits and carbon credits, do you think we can have a good grasp, for example, through things like natural capital, of the holistic value of some of these habitats? Or do you think, and do you think there's good understanding of that among different stakeholders? Because obviously things like biodiversity credits and carbon credits can be easily kind of added in, but what do you think about that more holistic picture?
I think, I mean, the science and the mechanisms and tools are there to support it. I think it is well understood, but it's in amongst a certain subsection of society. Obviously, people that are familiar with this know about it, but I think more broadly, you know, the concept of natural capital is quite alien to a lot of people still. Even technical people still get confused around the use of the terminology. So I think, and there's the whole debate around whether or not you should monetize, commoditize nature, and you could go into a discussion down that route for quite a long time, which we probably won't do. But I think it's an important mechanism. It's a conversation starter, right? So if you want to effectively say to someone, look, you can do this approach or this approach, and it's you're talking to business, then the loudest voice in the room is often to do with pounds and dollars. So if you can at least paint a picture and say it's a representation of what you get out, and it has this value associated with it, regardless of its inherent value or its existence value, then I think it's a useful tool. And for me, if you view it in that light, then it's still important. I think Pete wants to chip in.
Yeah, please, Pete.
I was just going to say there is this emerging idea as we move away, as we're replacing CAP since we exited the EU, to replace the payments that we give to land managers and farmers and landowners, to pay them for public goods rather than to subsidise the private goods. So we're still going to be subsidising our land sector, but to move the subsidies towards public money for public goods, and that's enshrined within the ALMS framework in England and some equivalent legislation that we have in all of the devolved administrations around the country. So I think that's a big step forward, and that's sort of based on natural capital. So those ideas are getting through, and this idea of paying where we used to pay farmers to produce too much. We had built mountains and all sorts of other things in the EU many years ago, when I was probably you're too young to remember, but I remember those, where we were paying farmers to produce things that they got paid for anyway, the private goods. And this move to providing public goods, I think, is a big step forward.
Thanks, Pete and Matthew. Yeah, those are both really, really good points. Thank you. A question from an attendee here. Do you think nature-based solutions will become a compulsory requirement for developments going forward in the UK? I'll throw that open to either of you who want to come in.
Pete,
go ahead, Matthew. I'll come in after you.
Thank you. No, I don't think it would become a compulsory or mandatory process. It's I guess it always depends on the lens which you're looking at it through. So, there are elements. So BNG, biodiversity net gain, is going to be mandatory, and therefore, there are nature-based solutions approaches. Again, it's kind of a palette of tools and options that you can take to help address the BNG criteria and requirements. So, and similarly around sort of sustainable urban drainage systems, I think there's some legislation in place for new developments around that now. So again, you could look at, there are bits of legislation and compulsory requirements out there, and then it's looking at your nature-based solutions package of options and applying those to the different bits. Pete?
Yeah, overall, I don't think it's necessarily the best thing for it to be mandated. It's better to do it through incentivizing their use, because they do have so many other public good benefits, that it would make sense to the person doing the development, making the intervention. It makes sense for government, and it makes sense for wider society. So I don't think you really need to mandate it. I think you can just encourage it and incentivize it through the subsidy system, through paying for those services.
Great, thank you. And I'm not sure if either of you have a view on this, but just to throw it out there, how do you see nature-based solutions working alongside construction developments and reuse of soil? Do either of you have a kind of thought on that? Pete?
I am a soil scientist, so I really should have a great answer for this, but I don't really. So there are lots of nature-based solutions that involve in situ soils. So there are lots of things that we can do within farming that regenerative agriculture is really a great example of a nature-based solution. But for soils that have been removed, for example, from the construction industry, that's not something I mean, you could imagine repurposing those soils and, making in the same way as you do biodiversity net gain, you could do soil net gain, right? So if you're taking them from one area, you could restore it in others. But it's not something I've really thought through. It's a great question. I'll have to think more about it before I can give an intelligent answer.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Pete. What kind of struck me in both of your talks is obviously to unlock nature-based solutions as multifunctional is going to require systems thinking principles and supporting interdisciplinarity. I just wonder if you guys have any reflections on what you think can support this, because as you've mentioned, there can be quite a siloed approach to different areas. So what do you think are some key success factors in supporting systems thinking and interdisciplinarity? Pete, you first, then I'll go to you, Matthew. Thanks.
I think in the academic sphere, it's already quite embedded in our thinking. In the support that we get through projects is often a requirement for them to be interdisciplinary. I think the main issue is going to be maybe in the practitioners. So where there's planning decisions being made in local government departments, for example, they're chronically understaffed. They're very stretched. The budgets are small. And they really don't have the time or space, the headspace, I suppose, to get adequately trained up. So one of the big blocking points might be the capacity within the local decision makers to actually encourage and encourage the enhancement of nature-based solutions in things like planning applications. So that's where consultancies and others like Matthew's, I guess, can help. So over to Matthew.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's I guess it's all around collaboration and potentially that kind of public-private collaboration like Pete's just alluded to. I think there's loads of really interesting and great research coming out around, I guess, the sort of specifically the health benefits of exposure to nature. And I don't sort of, it never ceases to amaze me some of the sort of facts and figures that you see and the research around the positive impacts of street trees on and the correlation or reverse correlation between the prescription of antidepressants and things like that. So I mean, there's this direct cognitive kind of link between green and nature and our health, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise because we came out of the forests. So there's this historic kind of link there somewhere in our being, and I think it's around our I guess our local authorities and local government and other key actors in sort of health space and academia as well, just working collaboratively and looking at those opportunities and seeing the kind of the broader benefit. So whether or not it is this movement towards kind of green prescriptions, taking patients out of just going and receiving traditional treatment and prescriptions and saying, go and spend some time in nature because it'll actually have more benefit and I guess benefit from multiple different angles as well. So mental benefit as well as fresh air and physical activity. So there are many different wins there, I think. And I think it's just around having the right people in the right places to kind of join the dots up, which is obviously easier said than done.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to finish off with the last question today, which is just around what you think some of the barriers are to the implementation of nature-based solutions. And given the vast suite of different solutions that you've both outlined, how can we share learning between these and try and upscale some of these solutions? Matthew, can I turn to you for that one first?
Yeah, I think the barriers is quite and is what I'm seeing as well in way in what is still a relatively new role. So I came into this role with GHD a year ago almost, and it was a new function for the company. So we are having quite fledgling conversations still, and it's just not on some people's radars. And even if it is, as they don't necessarily always understand what it is or the potential range of applications that it can encompass. And again, it comes down to what's the problem that you're trying to address, what's your challenge, and then what lens you're looking at it through. So I think that's probably the main barrier. I mean, there's all this kind of thinking around that it's actually, you know, more expensive, or it doesn't work, or hesitation around will it perform the same job when you're thinking around quite, you know, big issues like flooding. You want to know that it's going to work. So people put their faith in steel and concrete because it's, you know, very hard and very visible. You can see it, it's tangible. Whereas if you're looking at a floodplain, you're like, is that going to protect me? I don't know. So people see safety in something hard and big in front of them. And so I guess there's hesitation, lack of understanding, and to some extent, I guess the evidence base is still very much in its infancy. So the term nature-based solutions wasn't coined until 2016 or something. It wasn't put down and actually defined by the IUCN until 2016. And I think its first use was late 2000s. So in its current form and our understanding of nature-based solutions, it's quite a new concept. So it's, yeah, and for those reasons, it's understandable that there's some degree of hesitation, I think.
Thanks, Matthew. Pete, did you want to add to that?
It's a great outline of some of the barriers there. Moving into the solution space, I think it's showing people what can be done. If you can show successful examples, case studies where it's really worked, that really helps. And the University of Oxford has set up an atlas of nature-based solutions, a global atlas, which gives good examples of nature-based solutions that have been used all over the world. There's another one, I can't quite remember where it's based. It's based abroad, looking specifically at urban nature-based solutions, ones that have been applied in cities. So that information is getting out there, and having that resource available is a great tool to be able to say, when you're trying to get the point across, it all sounds a bit abstract, it's all a bit new, as Matthew says. If you can say, look what they've done here, this is a town that's not so different from yours, and they've done this, and it's had these beneficial outcomes in addition to solving the problem that you were trying to solve in the first place.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share that link with with some of our members. I think that would be great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Matthew.
I think that might be the one that I've just dropped a link into the chat. It might be the one you were referring to, Pete. It's Urban Green Up. Is that the one? That's got quite a nice selection of examples in there.
Yeah, that's the one. And then there's the other one, which is more broad nature-based solutions, which is done out of the nature-based solutions initiative at University of Oxford. That's said, and then colleagues.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. That's great. Well, just a massive thank you again to Pete, Matthew and Bridget for their presentations. It's been such an interesting conversation that we've had today, and such an important discussion about linking climate and biodiversity and also pollution as well, bringing that into some of the conversations. A massive thank you as well to our attendees for logging in. I hope you found that as useful and informative as I did. If you are an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar on the IES CPD tool, which you could do by logging into the members area. And as you would have seen, this webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on our website and YouTube channel. If you are watching on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. So this is actually the last IES webinar before the Christmas break. So I wanted to wish you all a very happy Christmas. Our next event will be an IAQM webinar on the 10th of January, focused on air quality and biodiversity impacts of future agricultural scenarios in the UK and how spatial modelling provides policy insights. And you can register for this on the IAQM and IES website. Thank you to everyone for coming today. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.